REALPOLITIK. I'm Anthony Durgans. I'm the research officer, and I'm here with our CEO, Rebecca Ayers, and we're doing another REALPOLITIK video for 2020. So, Rebecca, in light of the coronavirus, I wanted to ask, is there more evidence pointing toward this pandemic being natural or man-made? And if it is man-made, what do you think is the intent behind it?
All right. I would first start with what has been told to the public officially. The coronavirus, or novel coronavirus, or COVID-19, as people say in abbreviation, appeared from Lushan province in China. They state that it originated from animals, and then it spread to other parts of the world, and it became a global phenomenon called a pandemic. Like an epidemic is where it takes place like at a national level, but a pandemic is global. It's like a global epidemic. That's one aspect. Now, there is evidence that COVID-19 was manufactured. A team of virologists in the University of Delhi had done research and studied the actual DNA structure, particularly the protein structures in the coronavirus, and they noticed that it was very similar to the DNA code sequence in AIDS virus. And it implies that COVID-19 could possibly have been bioengineered or man-made and not a natural occurring phenomenon. So on one hand, you have the origin being from animals, being a type of virus that no one has ever heard of. That's why they call it the novel virus. And on the other hand, you hear a group of virologists who see evidence that points to the fact or the possibility that the virus was manufactured, that it was man-made. Now, in terms of who benefits the most from this, is that what you said?
Well, that was my...
Okay, so what you said the intent?
Yeah, like if it is man-made, what is the intent behind it?
If it is man-made, the intent would be there could be a range of intent, right? Because it's not just affecting people's lives in terms of any possible depopulation agendas, but it's also affecting the economy and the prices of oil. And we know that the US dollar is pegged to oil, the petrodollar. So that's also affecting the value of the dollar. Right now, you have the Federal Reserve actually maintaining the value of the dollar by buying up US Treasury notes. When I was last on the Federal Reserve's website, I had seen that a lot of countries had sold huge amounts of their investments in US Treasury notes, US Treasury bonds, in the last couple of years prior to this epidemic. And those are all interesting developments that led up to this point where we find ourselves in the global economy. So those are things to keep in mind when you're doing your research. So when you look at the price of the dollar, it's being artificially held together because apparently there is this freeze in the economy, but with the Federal Reserve buying up US Treasury notes, it keeps the dollar stable, but artificially. It's not a true demand. Especially in lieu of the times it's happening right now. I think that's as far as I can go in terms of the intent behind a virus being manufactured. It could be depopulation, it could be to restructure the economy. Emergency situations do have restructuring, properties. Like in terms of, political phenomenon. Like a war can do the same thing, but maybe a war could take too many resources, whereas a epidemic would be more efficient, right? You don't have to use so much manpower, so much overt hard power. You could use soft power. You could be more subtle with the way you throw with the way one would throw their weight around in the political environment.
Okay. Now, who has benefited the most from the current pandemic?
Oh, okay. So that was the question I thought you had asked me.
Yes.
So I would say that in terms of who benefits the most, it would be those who could best mitigate the damages from that. Like going back to what I was saying earlier with the first question about the intent behind a manufactured virus. Whether there's an intent or no intent to manufacture a virus, or whether it's not manufactured at all, I would say that those who benefit the most from it would be big corporations. Corporations that could still meet the demands of their clients virtually, whereas you have small businesses who rely on their storefront to conduct business, and that's the very thing that cannot really take place if they're considered a non-essential business at this time. So you have big companies who can actually ship to their customers, who have the distribution channels, who have those capital reserves to kind of insulate themselves from the risks of what's happening to the economy right now. They can recover, they have the means to recover, they have access to pools of capital that smaller businesses don't have access to government grants and other programs to help them cope with this issue, because if they have a huge market share in the economy, the government is going to pay more attention to those big companies, because if those companies go bankrupt or if they go down, that would significantly impact the economy. So the weight of these large firms are also measured by their market share, because it not only would affect that company, but it would potentially affect the whole economy because they have such a huge market share. And that's kind of the reasoning why governments support large businesses, because of their market share. So that, on one end, it's a good thing, and on the other end, it leaves small businesses out. So it's like a trade-off, right? You can't have really, both cap-size companies, the capital size of a company, the size of a firm, really determines how it can cope in times of emergency and what kind of help it gets. And that's why I say that big businesses are more prone to being able to cope with this and even benefit and dominate the market, because they can meet a demand during a time of emergency that small companies can't do. At the same time, not only big businesses, but also big countries potentially can benefit from the epidemic as well. Not in terms of the threat that it does to their large population, but rather in terms of the level of power that they can exert over their population, because they freed up their powers to do so. Because when a country is in a state of emergency doctrine or continuity of government doctrine is basically, it's a mechanism in which a country kind of allows itself to relax its own laws so that it can meet the needs of an emergency. But in the course of doing so, those extra powers that it wouldn't normally have can create a political risk of people's rights being violated, right? It suspends constitutions. It suspends certain international agreements, those protections, those checks and balances that are important to maintaining even a remote sense of a balance of power. So there's always two, sides of every equation, of every argument. So on one hand, you can say that state of emergency doctrine kind of creates that fluidity that you need to respond to an emergency situation. On the other side, on the flip side, it can create a risk of potentially growing into a tyrannical regime. So
Yes.
you have to always keep in mind of those balances and not abuse power. And that's something that citizens should be concerned about, that while they are cooperating in hopes of, preventing any risks to their health, they shouldn't, it shouldn't be so much that it's more than what's necessary, right? Because then people's rights can be violated. And the whole purpose in emergency doctrine is to protect people's lives and not to make their lives worse,
Yes.
right? When it makes people's lives worse, then that's when the doctrine, cuts off and something else, like tyranny, continues. So we need to make sure that we do set limits even in states of emergency.
Okay, that makes sense. From our third question, can you compare the political position of African Americans prior and then during the crisis?
African Americans, our political position before and after
Yeah,
the
well,
COVID-19?
before and during.
Before and during. Okay. So African Americans as a population were already in a pretty unhealthy political position prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? You had the 2007-2008 housing crisis where African American homeowners were the most detrimentally and materially affected by the housing crisis. It practically wiped out our middle class, and it was growing in the early 2000s, in the late 90s, and then the housing crisis kind of really inhibited that kind of growth. And then you had the recession, right, period. And then now, before I go into now, and then you also had black banks, where we had like 60 banks like in the early 2000s, and now we're down to like 21 black-owned banks, right? And there's a principle in economics where if a particular group of people own a certain number of businesses or occupy a certain number of white-collar jobs, it also creates like 5 like blue-collar and minimum wage job opportunities for other members of their group. So the less people own businesses and occupy white-collar positions, the less is available to those who qualify for lesser positions, like even minimum wage jobs and blue-collar jobs. So when we had those shifts and those losses in our businesses, it affected the economy of our whole population as African Americans. We kind of have like a sub-economy based on the capital infrastructure within our group, like our business capacities. And that created a even more disparity and wealth gap with our colleagues, right? Other groups of people. And additionally, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, right?
Yes.
Where you had a lot of, dialogue, talking about, raising awareness about how African Americans, due to, constructs or ideologies like white supremacy, actually being harmed and targeted through hate crimes, experiencing institutional and structural racism in public agencies that actually put their lives in danger and their lives at risk as a U.S. citizen, right? As a particular U.S. citizen belonging to a particular group of people, a protected class. Race is the protected class in our legal system and also in the international legal system as well. So when you have those issues taking place, we see that all the means that we had to cope with risk, to cope with harm, were being stripped away from us, right? You also had even, prior to the 2007-2008 housing crisis, you had the event of 9/11.
Yes.
Where you had the Patriot Act passed. And while one could argue, and rightly so, that 9/11 had nothing to do with African Americans, the fact that it actually started to undermine our civil rights and civil liberties, that materially affected us, because when you're a population that's very vulnerable to harm, very vulnerable to exploitation across, various sectors of society, both public and private, you depend on those laws to protect you, to protect your rights, because you don't have the kind of infrastructure to protect yourself. So when those laws are loosened and there's, wiggle room and it starts to be undermined because there's something that they claim is more important than that, like national security, then that puts an already vulnerable population at more risk. And that's the situation you had African Americans in prior to the COVID-19. They were already starting to roll back on their rights, right, on laws that protected our population. We lost a lot of our private home ownership. We lost a lot of our businesses, particularly our banks, our financial institutions that are kind of like the engines to our sub-economy within the U.S. economy. You had cases of us actually being exploited by not only private individuals through hate crime, but also public agencies through racial profiling. And then now you have this pandemic. This pandemic has actually further aggravated the already unfortunate and detrimental position African Americans found themselves in. Because now, because COVID-19 is considered an emergency situation, you have an executive order in place, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, county level, and municipal level, like your cities and towns, actually enforce executive orders in and of themselves. Because not only the president isn't the only person that can issue an executive order. Any executive branch head can issue an executive order for its jurisdiction, like the governor of a state can issue an executive order. A mayor of a city can issue an executive order and declare a state of emergency for their municipality or their state and country respectively. So we have a national state of emergency, a state level state of emergency, and a municipal level state of emergency. So even where you have laws in certain cities that are better than laws in other cities or counties or states or countries, with a state of emergency, it freezes a lot of laws. It suspends constitutional law. And if you think about, the average person's knowledge about the law usually stems from what we know about the Constitution. We don't really know those technical nuances of laws because we're not attorneys. But one thing that most citizens do know in their respective countries and areas is their Constitution, right? Their constitutional rights. But those are the very rights that are suspended during a state of emergency. So the only law that we know about is frozen in place. Like take, for example, the shelter-in-place policy, where people are told that they cannot assemble themselves. What's the constitutional right that we know of that protects things related to that? A peaceful assembly, right?
Yeah.
Peaceful assembly, the right to peacefully assemble is a constitutional right. That's been suspended because of COVID-19. People are even prohibited from exercising their religion at their place of worship, whether it's, a church, mosque, or otherwise, any other temple, religious service that people would, attend. So that's also a constitutional right that's been suspended, right? You can't sue a government entity for suspending a constitutional right when it's in a state of emergency. And now you have courts, particularly civil courts, are closed. So if there's a civil harm that you incur from a private or public individual and you want to sue for that civil wrong, you're very limited into what you can sue for because courts are being restricted in terms of the services and the cases that they handle. The only cases I think that are handled at courts at this time that's not as restricted is in criminal courts that deal with criminal cases. And as if you don't know, you may know, criminal law is managed by the state apparatus. It's a public it's a public case, so it's handled by the public agencies. Like, take for example, in civil law, you would have an individual suing another individual, but with criminal law, it's the state suing an individual or suing a company or organization, right? So a private person can't be a plaintiff for a criminal case. Even the victim can't sue, the victim can't charge the offender with a crime. It's the prosecutor who does that. And the prosecutor represents, the state. He's the state's attorney, the government's attorney. So now you see this shift to public agencies, the bureaucracy. It's becoming more bureaucratic, more administrative. And those are things that, private individuals have no control over. So the very tools in society that private individuals had to protect themselves from harm being done to them is frozen. And how does this affect African Americans? All we had was our public powers. Our rights protected under the Constitution, now frozen. Our rights to sue for civil wrongs done to us, now restricted. And access to public facilities, restricted, limited. And we lost a lot of our private and home ownership and business ownership, and businesses and homes are one of the few, types of assets that you can still, operate during these times. You don't have a business. So there's no real essential travel unless it's for business purposes. But if you're not a business, what are you doing traveling? We lost a lot of our homes. So even if we wanted to, gather together, we would have to use a public facility to do so, but public facilities are closed. So you're restricted again. But if you had private property, you could still assemble yourselves and gather amongst, your people. So if you look at it, we're being boxed in from a political perspective. We don't know if this issue is going to clear up and things are going to go back to, I guess, what was more normal than this. But what we do know is that we were already in a very vulnerable situation, which got worse. And now it is even much more worse than it was before COVID-19. And that's the political situation in which African Americans find themselves. They're pretty much limited from doing anything.
Right. That was a very elaborate response. For my fourth question, I want to know, why is it that when African Americans are suffering from persecution on the domestic, and how come they don't garner as much support like other groups do on the domestic or international level?
A lot of people would say that's not true. When something happens to an African American person or just an African descent person, it's covered all over in the news. It has a lot of media exposure, and everybody hears about it. However, what is very little talked about isn't so much our media exposure or our voice as much as it is solving the problem that's been covered in the news. We don't get support in terms of solutions, even if we get support in terms of coverage. You could look at media exposure as just, a giant gossip column. Gossip, it spreads the word, but it doesn't necessarily help the person that's being gossiped about. Like, look what happened to so-and-so. Isn't that a shame? That poor thing, right? That poor dear. But if you, I know some people think that media exposure is a good thing. At least your issues are out there, your issues are addressed. However, from a real political realism perspective, it actually doesn't look good when your group of people are constantly being harmed and that harmed is covered on the news. It's like a company with a bad reputation. Like, even if the company doesn't do anything wrong, but wrong things happen to it, like its factory gets set on fire or something, or its employees do something to it that harms it, or its system got hacked into, you start to trust that company less because that company can't even look after itself. Like, it can't make sure that it's okay. It's always being harmed. Even if it's not the one harming itself, it's always being subject to someone harming it. So you're like, how resilient is this company? How resilient is this organization if it's always being subject to something? I mean, I'm not going to invest in that. Because, even if they do everything, cross every T, dot every I, something's going to happen to that company. It's just going to go under, right? And people look at populations of people, ethnic groups, and races in much the same way, like stock, like an investment. People invest in a race. They invest in a group of people who represents a certain set of values, who have a certain way of doing things, right? And even though we get a lot of admiration in terms of being a sort of, cultural or moral authority in the world, one of the terms that was thought of for the Congressional Black Caucus was the conscience of the Congress. Like, if Congress had a conscience, it would be the Congressional Black Caucus. That was the kind of reputation that they had built up for themselves over the years since they started during like the 60s, around the Civil Rights era, when a lot of African Americans were running for office. However, being a conscience that is either ignored or being harmed is like being a spirit without a body. It's a kind of ghostly political existence. And no one, in a materialistic world, in a very secular world, no one wants to invest in that. In fact, it'll actually encourage people to kind of stay away from you, because even if you're an excellent person with all kinds of skills and talents and, excellent character, trouble follows that person. Even if that person doesn't invite it, the trouble will come to them, and some people will get the idea that it's just best to stay away from that person. They're accident prone.
Right.
So that's why media exposure of our issues in which we're being harmed isn't necessarily a good thing. It actually makes African Americans look bad, even if they're not doing anything bad. The fact that bad things happen to them is enough. And reputation is everything in politics. Even when we're voting for a president, we want that candidate to be a fighter. We want them to be a winner. We don't want them to be a loser. We like it when they grill their, competition during those presidential debates. Like, oh, that was an excellent argument. Oh, they clocked that argument. They debunked it, right? Versus when they're losing an argument, when they're being attacked verbally, and they just seem like they're being subject to all kinds of angles from other candidates running for that same office, right? They're like, right. And then we're like, as an audience, oh, they can't handle this. If they can't even handle, this debate, how about a presidency, right? When they'll be getting more criticisms and more this and more that, right? They don't seem very resilient. So, they seem like they'll drop out of the race even before, the general election. And we look at groups of people just like, we're going to vote for them, right? And who would vote for African Americans, seeing that they're always being harmed and subject to someone else's will? So that doesn't really do well for our population as a people. And I'm not sure if I answered your question. You said our political position? Is that what you're talking about?
Like from the domestic and political sphere, but...
Oh, yeah. So, this COVID-19, this pandemic, it makes everything worse for us. Worse than it already was. We have a position in this society that is such where if you are not strong, then you will be crushed. And we must try to, extricate ourselves from that victim that's always being harmed, persecuted stereotype. And it's a pity that it's not just a stereotype, it's also a political reality at this time.
Yes. Okay. My next question, how has this affected the balance of power in the global political environment, and what does that have to do with African Americans?
The balance of power, well, I guess I should describe what a balance of power is first. Balance of power is a lot like a balance in government branches. Like you have the executive, judicial, and legislative branch. And the key in a democratic country is where these branches of government check and balance each other. Like one can't have more power than the other. At least that's the goal. That's the ideal. It doesn't really happen like that in reality. There's going to be some branches that have more power than others, in certain situations. But just sticking to the concept of a balance of power, of checks and balances, where you can't have a usurper because there are other powers, forces present to keep any one particular force from getting out of term, from crossing the line. It creates a threshold, a standard of conduct. Like you can only go so far, so fast. And so if you can understand that for a country, then you can also understand that for the global sphere, right? Now you're looking at forces of nation states, of countries. Countries can only go so far in a balance of power. They cannot be arbitrary. They can't just go around pillaging through other people's countries and causing a ruckus, warring here and there. Other countries, other forces, other global forces will be present to make sure that no other country goes too far. That would be a global balance of power. Now, you said, how does this COVID-19 affect the global balance of power?
Yeah, and what does that do with African Americans?
And what does that have to do with African Americans? Okay, so the way COVID-19 affects the balance of power is that it actually shifts the balance of power even more to the extreme end. We already did not have a global balance of power because you have the political disparity between the global north and the global south. The global north are those first world, those rich countries that make up like the G20, and you have, the top 20 economies. And then you have, the global south, those second and third world countries who have not really arisen to the level of, political influence on all aspects of political life as their, global north counterparts. And what's interesting is that this global north, this global south, they actually happen to be related to those two directional polarities, those two directions. Like if you look on the map, most of the third and second world countries are literally on the south to the Earth's equator. And then the first world countries are actually really from the equator to the north of the Earth's equator. Like if you were to get a globe, and that's why we came up with this term global north, global south. It's really talking about the direction, and it just so happens to describe the polarity too. So it's an interesting term. very geopolitical. So going back to COVID-19 and the balance of power with the global environment, it creates more power for those first world countries, for the global north, over the global south. Because the global north just so happens to comprise the world's leaders. It's just like with those big companies with a huge market share in a nation's economy. These big countries have a huge political market share in the political economy, in the political environment, in terms of the world and how the world is governed and managed. They have a huge influence. They determine what the little countries are going to do. Just like how big companies kind of determine the trends that little companies are going to follow, and in the process of trying to compete with a bigger company. So they set the trend. And if they set the trend and there's an emergency, other little countries are going to look to those bigger countries for leadership. And so that gives big countries who already had a huge influence on the world more power to be arbitrary, if they want to be. And they can take advantage of the COVID-19 or anything to do that. Even if COVID-19 is a natural phenomenon, it doesn't matter if it's artificial or natural. A person, an entity, can take advantage of the situation, right? Anyone could.
Yes.
If they found the circumstances favorable to them, if they saw an opportunity. Opportunism, right? So that's why I don't really pay attention to whether it's artificial or not. It's really important about what it's doing, how it's functioning, and how it's affecting our lives. So how does this affect African Americans in terms of this balance of power in the world? Now, if we ever wanted to create international dialogue about our issues and get our issues addressed, and we wanted, the world to be involved in that dialogue, in that talk, the world will be influenced to take the position of whatever countries that are powerful. And if those powerful countries have an interest that contradicts our well-being, then we have no one to talk to. There would be no one, even if smaller or little countries agree and empathize, they don't have the power to do anything beyond say, I feel for you. They may not even have the power to say, I feel for you, that I feel sorry for what has happened to you. Politics can even go down to a person's thoughts, where they will say that they hear no evil and they see no evil. So there's no evil. They will not even recognize that there's a problem. They'll find every fact that they can scrape, every, issue that they can find to dispel your argument, because they're not looking to find you correct. They're looking to find you incorrect, because they cannot afford for you to be correct, because they are being pressured by forces greater than them to hold a particular position with respect to you. So that's how it affects African Americans, and it can also explain why other groups have, more, solutions and more support for them than what African Americans do. Notice, a lot of people like to say that because we're in a first world country, we should be all set and dandy. Other people are able to make it. You should be able to do the same thing. Stop complaining, stop whining, get to work or go find work or try to start your own business. Follow the procedure, follow those guidelines, follow the process that we've paved for you and try it out and see if it works. So, that's why we're told these things and we don't really know what to say because we don't recognize that it's not that we don't have a good point. It's the fact that the majority of people do not wish to see our valid point. So our valid point could be 100% true, but it will not be recognized. And recognition is very important in politics. It's actually what makes a country a country. Did you know you can have a country that's not a country in politics? How so? If other countries, particularly the big boy countries, right, the key players, the huge, countries, if they don't recognize a country as a country, the world does not consider it a country. So their recognition validates or gives a country legitimacy. So if you have no recognition, you have no political legitimacy in the global environment. And that will affect what? Trade. Other countries will be told by bigger countries not to do business with you. Just like if you have a big corporation and it doesn't like a small company that seems like it's competing with it, it will tell other businesses in the area not to do business with this company. They'll try to hog all the business away from the company that is its competitor. So eventually, that little company that could have become big one day falls.
Yes.
And it never gets there. And the same thing happens in politics. So, and also negotiating instruments. African Americans do not have a negotiating instrument that they use to negotiate a solution for themselves with other stakeholders, right? Other groups of people get more attention for their issues because they have a negotiating instrument that they use. I won't necessarily say that African Americans do not have a negotiating instrument, but even if they had one, they wouldn't use it, and if they did use it, they wouldn't use it right. And when you lack a negotiating instrument in politics, there's no obligation to help you. They say in law, if someone is in peril, there's no legal obligation to help that person out of their peril. Right? You could just, someone could be drowning, you could just see them, and then you could just keep walking, and fiddling on your phone, even though you knew someone was drowning down the stream. Right? A person won't be sued for that.
Right.
However, we do say in law that if you create someone's peril, you do have an obligation to rescue them. Because you created the harm, you rescue them. But politics is even worse than law. You thought that was harsh. In politics, they can even create your peril and have no obligation to help you out of it. Why? Because you have no negotiating instrument. If you have a negotiating instrument, then they'll be like, I could lose something if you use that negotiating instrument. Okay, how do you want me to help you? Okay, you see how it works? So, when other groups use their negotiating instrument, then we see them with all kinds of support. We just see the after effects. We don't see those backroom conversations where they're saying, I have this and this and that. That will cause you a great loss. So what are you going to do for us to both be happy today? Right?
Right.
But African Americans, they do not have or use a negotiating instrument that could create a potential loss in those who have the means to help them resolve their problems. We think that because they created peril for us, or because we think they did, or because we're just in peril, period, that people should just be clamoring to help us because we're so pitiful and we're in so much need, right? Be a good Samaritan, that sort of a thing. But politics doesn't work that way. Unless they're going to lose something if they don't help you, then there's no obligation to help you. It's just too bad, so sad. Even if they created that harm, it's like, oh, whoops. But, it's on that person to save themselves out of the situation that someone else caused them. So we may consider it Machiavellian, we may consider it bullish or kind of cruel or crooked, but that is political realism. That's why we call this realpolitik, right? Political realism. I'm not of a school of thought where ideologies and, fun, love, and happiness is something that, governs politics. We call that rhetoric. But, those transactions, those, bullish and kind of Machiavellian kind of interactions really comprise the reality of politics. And it's interesting that we recognize that with our society, like day-to-day interactions, where, we could, or a person could treat someone in a social environment